Good evening and welcome to the panel, Yes, in Your Backyard, co-sponsored by the Cleveland Park Historical Society and the DC Preservation League. I'm Andrea Podolsky, president of the board of the Cleveland Park Historical Society. We decided to convene this panel because ADUs seem to be becoming a hot topic here and around the country. Tonight's discussion is not intended as advocacy for large-scale redevelopment in Cleveland Park, nor does it presume that every property is appropriate as an ADU. What we will be discussing are the types of projects that are typically considered compatible, the safeguards and review processes in place that homeowners and residents should know about, and how the DC Historic Preservation Office evaluates ADUs in historic districts. And now I'd like to introduce my co-host, Zach Burt, DCPL's Community Outreach and Grants Manager.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. And as Andrea just mentioned, I'm Zach Burt. I'm the Community Outreach and Grants Manager of the DC Preservation League. And we're excited to be collaborating again with the Cleveland Park Historical Society. So hopefully we can keep these series of sessions going, and especially on such a relevant and popular topic that Andrea just mentioned. So tonight's webinar will include two presentations followed by Q&A. And during the presentations, feel free to drop your comments and questions into either the Q&A or chat boxes, and we'll get to that during our discussion later tonight. Just keep in mind that there's no audio function on here. So if you have a question or comment, please type it in. And now I'm going to turn it over to tonight's panelists, Ileana Schinder and Todd Jones. Ileana is an architect in Washington, D.C. She graduated with a bachelor's in architecture from the Universidad Nacional de Córdoba in Argentina in 2000, and an MA in communications from American University here in town in 2006. She was inspired to become an architect at the age of 4 by playing with Legos on the floor. She remains motivated to design houses of all sizes 40 years later. Since opening her architecture studio in 2014, with creativity and innovation, she has designed additional dwelling units that create new spaces for clients and their families to thrive. As part of her efforts to educate the public on housing issues, Ileana has also written in blogs and held sessions to inspire and promote innovative models of home. Ileana is the author of Housing for Humans, a book to imagine, create, and design a new housing model in America. Ileana was born and raised in Argentina. She lives in DC with her family and her dog, Colette. And then Todd Jones has worked at the DC Historic Preservation Office since 2020, where he has conducted project reviews, historical research, and preservation planning. He previously worked as a historical researcher and as a historic preservation specialist with the Federal Emergency Management Agency in the New England region. He is originally from Connecticut and earned a master's degree in public history from Central Connecticut State University. Welcome, Ileana and Todd.
Thanks, Zach.
Yeah, so Ileana, feel free to share your screen and we can jump right into your presentation.
Okay, let me share presentation. Just give me a thumbs up, Zach, if you see my screen.
Yep, you're good to go.
Perfect. I hope that we have no issues clicking through the presentation. So here we go. So this is me. You'll see that it's pretty much the way Zach introduced me. That's the book that I wrote several years ago about additional dwelling units and ways to live in the city. It's available in the public library and as well as through Libby, or you can buy it. I'm from Argentina and the World Cup's coming, and I always joke that I'm very available for questions and phone calls. Check your calendar to make sure that there's no Argentina game going on. I may not be very focused during those time slots. But let's talk about ADUs, what they are and what they're not. That is the biggest question that comes up. Additional dwelling unit, first off, it's a building, which is a very basic thing to say, but I see so many things. So, well, if I convert this shed, if I convert this bus, if I convert this boat into a dwelling, is that an additional dwelling unit? Truth be told, the ADUs, it needs to be a building, right? A full-on building with foundations, with a roof, with proper insulation and everything to function as a building. The additional dwelling unit is a secondary unit to the main house. It can be located as like a garage or a detached structure. It can be attached to the main house. It can be a basement or an attic. Because of the housing stock we have in DC, the most common models you're going to see are always the detached in the rear or in the basement, just because it's the type of houses we have. If you look more into the suburbs, you're going to see a lot more detached structures. And the more urban the environment, the closer they are to the main building. What's important to understand about ADUs is that they are part, property-wise and tax-wise, they're part of one unit, of one site, right? So if you go to the city, your site, your land, your tax number will remain the same because the dwelling we're talking about is secondary to the main house. So every time you read about them, think about not as a condo or a duplex or an apartment building, but a building that is secondary to the main. And that's important to understand for all the rules we're going to go over later. Also, it's important to understand about from a historical perspective, because we're not creating more housing units per, how can I say, per legally, as in like tax base. You can't buy the additional dwelling unit. You can't sell it. You can't pull a mortgage just on that unit. It needs to be based on the whole property, right? Now, this is informational about who and why ADUs are so popular. Is we all talk about housing shortage, and not only we have housing shortage as a general term, but there are a lot of target clients or target households that are not fitting the current housing stock. We're talking multi-generational families, monoparental families, non-related adults living together. Think about boomerang children, think about friends, people that live together. So all those people, there's no housing stock currently that will satisfy their need. And the housing stock that exists is either too big or too inconvenient for that population to live in. So when you see housing shortage, don't focus so much as a numbers game, but think about a population group. And this is where ADUs are key to understand how to satisfy that need. This is something that I've read and I've included from AARP. There are a lot of nonprofit organizations working with additional dwelling units, educating the public. So thank you, Preservation League, for also talking about this. AARP obviously focuses mostly on the elderly. Their website's amazing for lots of data. They do a lot of analysis. There are other groups that do that as well. If you Google, if you search, there's a ton of research, very, if you get thick into the numbers, populations, cost, that kind of stuff. But let's talk about code, right? What makes an ADU and how to make it work in a city like DC that is full of rules, right? We have zoning, we have building, we have historic areas, we have tree preservation, building preservation. We have lots of rules. It's important to understand that the most important rules you're going to follow when you do an additional dwelling units, you're going to be looking at two books. You're going to be looking at the building code that regulates everything that goes from the building envelope, that is the walls and the roof, to the inside of the building. Think about railings, stairs, ceiling heights. That is building code. Now, there's the other code that says zoning. Zoning has to do with the relationship of buildings and its neighbors. So from the building envelope to the outside, setbacks, height, massing, lot area coverage. That affects the neighbors and the city. So when you're looking at a building and when you're trying to figure out if it's feasible to develop in your site, if you're thinking about something like this, think about both. The building code is pretty much universal. So Virginia, Maryland, DC, they all apply the same international building codes, pretty generic, with small amendments here and there. The zoning code, however, is extremely local. It's almost neighborhood by neighborhood. Also, part of the zoning code is if your property, or if the property we're talking about, falls under any special area, such as preservation, such as Commission of Fine Arts, so if you're like facing federal land, if you're facing any particular nature area, the size of the, so think about a multiple of books you'll be looking at. The two most important ones are the building code and the zoning code, right? So I love this image because it shows in toy what I mean by building code, such as the Barbie house, or zoning code, which is a Lego, right? In Lego, you can build a whole city. It doesn't matter what happens inside each building, but you have setbacks, heights, lot area coverage with each little block. You look at the Barbie house, you start looking at architectural elements from the distance of the toilet to the sink to the size of windows. So it's very specific what each building, each code will be focusing on when we talk about additional dwelling. So one of the most important things, and this happens a lot in DC, like I said, because of the housing stock, right? This is particularly important on additional dwelling units that happen in basements, but also in some garages when we want to split them in two heights. And it's a ceiling clearance. For an additional dwelling unit, I need 7 feet clear, right? From floor to the bottom of the ceiling. It's okay to have small interferences like beams or ducts or areas of small, like say a pitch roof, right? It's not going to be all 7 feet. But as far as you comply with a code that most of the space is 7 feet, you're good to go. If you have a basement that doesn't comply, there's things we can do like excavate and create that height. But it's important to think about not just what happens on the outside, but to have the ceiling height that complies. Here's where some people say, oh, here's a bus I convert into a house. Well, you don't have the ceiling clearance. So that is a condition that you won't comply. Oh, by the way, I'm happy to share this presentation with everyone when we're done. So don't worry about like taking notes or being super detailed. Here's another thing that's also very important in dwellings. It's pretty universal about main houses and additional dwelling units is egress and access, how I can get into a space and get out in case of an emergency. This applies to the general space of the ADU, but most importantly in bedrooms. You need to be able to have a window that complies with the International Building Code. This touches a little bit on historic preservation, because if we need to enlarge a window that is visible from the street, say a window well or some other feature required for the building code, then we need to cooperate with the DC historical group and say, hey, can we do this? Is it a good idea to do it towards the front or towards the back where it's not visible from the street? So here's where the building and the zoning code start working together. Mechanical systems are part of a requirement for a dwelling. You need to provide heating at every dwelling. This doesn't interfere with historic preservation. However, if you're going to use a certain type of mechanical equipment that has large pieces that need to be outside or too near neighboring structures, you may want to rethink the layout and everything so you don't create any conflicts with the area where this is getting developed. There are a requirement for dwellings, but you can choose among many, many different features, from air to radiators to anything. As far as you provide heating, you're good to go. Now, cooling is not a requirement, but do provide it if you're planning to develop one, because this is DC and global warming is going nowhere but up. And now there's one thing I want you to come back about mechanical, and it comes up a lot in basements. Mechanical equipment cannot be shared if the equipment lives inside one unit. So you have a basement and the furnace is in the basement. If you're going to renovate that basement, the furnace needs to be either in a shared space between the two units, say a vestibule or something like that, or it has to be in the unit where the heating is being provided, right? So in case of an emergency, in case something goes wrong, none of the dwellers need to go into the other apartment to have access to it. So that is a requirement, either in a common area like a vestibule, or each unit should have its own. There are many different ways to do this. You can use split systems. Again, there's no code requirement of which kind. Electrical is kind of the same. You will need to provide, obviously, electrical power to both units, but each of them need to have their panel within their existing envelope, right? If you have a unit in the basement, the person living in the basement can't go to the other floor or to the other apartment to flip a switch, right? It needs to be in its own space. There are all kinds of options how that can be achieved. The electrical code is very big. I don't like to read too much into detail, but I know the general requirements to know that I can't have a panel outside of the living space. Also, there are all kinds of requirements about proper receptacle distribution, grounding, lighting distribution, how many outlets you're going to have. All those requirements are universal, not just for ADUs, but also for main houses as well. Beware if you're planning to install as part of your project electrical panels or change light fixtures in places where historic preservation may be more restrictive about it. It has happened to me in Georgetown, other places. You may want to evaluate how to do it as not to interfere with the whole permitting process. I've never seen anything where it's a ban or a big scandal or anything, but it's one of those issues where you want to be respectful where the additional dwelling unit is happening, particularly if it's a freestanding garage, say, and you want to provide lighting towards the rear. You want to see how the lighting and the lighting fixtures interfere with the rest of the neighborhood. Plumbing, this is kind of silly, but yes, you do need to provide cold and hot water, bathroom, and cooking facilities. The rule about the water heating feature is just like mechanical and electrical. It either needs to be shared from a common space or within its own limit. You can do traditional tank, you can do heat pumps, you can do instant water, whatever fits the program you're developing. There are tons of options and it shouldn't be a problem. However, if you're planning to do a project and your current water heater is in the basement and you're planning to separate that, make sure you think about how you're going to supply water heating for the top unit. This is something that comes up a lot with, like, make sure you design around it. By the comments I make, you'll probably realize like the things have been headaches for me in the past. Fire separation. This is kind of a big asterisk because I've encountered different areas where fire separation is a requirement or requires different elements depending on the zone I'm in, depending on the type of buildings. If you have a specific question about it, email me and we're going to talk about what you're planning to do. Fire suppression is not a requirement 100% of the times, but fire separation is. Fire separation is extremely easy to achieve. A layer of 1/2 inch of drywall will do it. Don't perforate that ceiling and you're good to go. So don't think that this is a barrier for you to achieve a project like this if you're concerned about how to keep the building safe. The main intention is to keep fire and smoke from both units. So here we go. Area distribution, this is a code requirement, but I've never seen a case where you design a building and doesn't comply with this. And this is where we were talking earlier, can I turn any structure, any bus into a dwelling? And per building requirements, they say, no, you need to comply with minimum requirements for bedrooms, for headroom, for stairways, elements that have to do with health and safety. How many people occupy it? This is a very, very specific feature to the building code. But again, it's very easy to achieve, right? Now the IBC is going through some iterations on sleeping lofts and elements like that, but they haven't been implemented yet. That means like upper levels that you can reach without a stair, but with a ladder, but we're not going to get into that for now. As you can see, the code does change, not very often, but it does. Equipment, this is something, all the images you're looking at, those are projects that I've developed in the past. different basements, converted structures. This was a workshop in Parkview, in Georgia Avenue, and I think Irving, something like that. It was a beautiful building, pitched. We preserved the structure. They had a shaker side. And the kitchen you're looking at is very well laid out because all the equipment was, I would actually use smaller equipment today. All the equipment was narrower than standard. So it was, instead of your typical 30-inch range, we used 24. The typical, 24-inch dishwasher, we use 18. So there's no requirement in the code how small you can do things. And now that everyone's going electric, you don't need to supply gas. You don't, you can do an induction stove that is 18 inches wide. For the equipment requirement is, again, a full building requirement. But if you're going to have perforations in the building for exhaust or other features, make sure that any alterations you do to the outside of the building to accommodate that is acceptable in the area if you're going to go through a historic preservation review, right? I mean, I like to preserve as much as I can of the buildings, but sometimes the infrastructure demands that we do we do things that not everybody likes. Now, here's another thing that people think that doesn't exist, but it does. There's a huge element in the building code that has to do with energy. How much electricity, basically, how much power your building will demand. So they control issues under the code. DC is very strict about this, but ours jurisdictions like, Montgomery County, Arlington, they also follow different rules. Different requirements. And they control for insulation. They control for fenestration, that is windows and doors, like what type of, how much tight the building is, how much fresh air you're bringing in with your mechanical system, if you particularly use split system or something that doesn't bring fresh air, and space conditioning, how much volume that you don't oversupply heating and cooling, among many other requirements. But when you're looking at a renovation or even prefab or whatever construction system you're planning to use, make sure that this portion is not ignored, because this is very important when you apply for a construction permit, okay? And this is not a code requirement, but it's a code suggestion. Make sure that all the requirements for zoning and building codes are solved through design and not solved through, oh my God, I need to do this and I don't want to. If you have a building that you like, you're looking at a 2-car garage in Brooklyn, we didn't need to preserve anything there, but from an economy perspective, it made sense to preserve all the structural elements. We didn't have to break anything. We reused windows, doors, everything. So through the design, we solved for everything we needed, right? And we saved a ton of money because we reused the building as it was. We just added insulation, replaced windows, stuff like that. So even if this building had been in a historic preservation area, people would have looked at it, it's yeah, you're good to go, right? So through use design features to address all the demands you're going to have to solve for a building. Like I said to everyone, I'm always available to answer questions, except with FIFA World Cup games. I'm happy to share this. I want to make sure that I'm going to stick around to answer questions. And if something that you think I didn't address, or if you have a particular question about a site, feel free to reach out. Also, I can answer these verbally whenever you need. But I want you to make sure that design and construction will matter when you try to create an additional dwelling unit, particularly in an area where history matters, where the context where you're developing will matter. How you design it and how you build it will make that ADU a reality or will just never happen. The building and the zoning code sounds boring, but they're fundamental. You can't have a building if you don't comply with both. And then make sure that whoever you're designing for, be it a relative, be it rental, short, long-term, make sure that you are offering a building with quality of life. Basement, garage, whatever it may be, the the people that will use the building, those are the ones that matter more than the building, right? So when you're designing for that or building or planning about it, think who's going to use it, and that should drive most of the ideas. And then, like what we're doing here, work with stakeholders. People are in other groups that, Preservation League, the city, we all are constantly talking to make this process easier. And that's it. Also, you're looking at a one-car garage, again, same neighborhood, Parkview. I have more images somewhere, but my website, house also, there are lots of that. So yeah, Andrea, who's next?
Let's turn it over to Todd now, and then we'll segue into the questions.
I'm going to mute myself.
Thank you, Ileana. That was great.
Just bring up mine. Okay, everybody can see this?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, so first I want to thank the DC Preservation League and the Cleveland Park Historic Society for hosting this event, and I want to thank everyone for attending. I'm Todd Jones, and I'm a historic preservation specialist with the DC Historic Preservation Office. And I know ADUs are certainly getting a lot of attention. I noticed even on, if anybody watches CBS Sunday Morning, they had a story on ADUs just this last weekend. So tonight I'm going to talk about ADUs and historic preservation, including the review and design process for when you want to add an ADU in a historic district or to a landmark building. And I'm going to go over the basics first for the first half, and then second half I'm going to talk about some specific examples. So first I'm going to give some larger context. Historic properties have a high capacity. Accessory dwelling unit is a modern day term for an old idea. In the past, it was very common for homeowners to rent out a room or two, such as the basement, to a boarder to make some extra income. It was also very common to find housing in alleys where you now find automobile garages. Some early automobile garages had small apartments on top for the chauffeur, and some carriage houses and stables also had sleeping areas. So ADUs have historical precedence. ADUs and historic preservation are also a good fit. ADUs offer a way to add some density to a neighborhood without dramatically changing the character. Adding new alley housing is also a way to spark renewed interest in those historic alley housing dwellings. And when ADUs are added to an existing structure, it's also typically a much cheaper option than demolishing or fully replacing a building. And that's good for preservation as well as the environment, since, as we all know, the greenest building is the one that's already built. Keeping a structure intact and standing is usually always the most sustainable option. And it's also financially helpful to the homeowner. And as I said a little earlier, many historic houses in DC either already had what we now call an ADU in the past or are designed in a way to make adding one relatively easy. So when someone adds an ADU to a historic building, the work must get reviewed by our office. And the Historic Preservation Office is part of the DC government, specifically the Office of Planning. We do historic preservation planning, protection, and public engagement. The work includes DC programs, federal programs, and archaeology. So we serve as the State Historic Preservation Office for the District of Columbia. And so we carry out many federal duties under that role. But we also serve as the staff of the Historic Preservation Review Board, or the HPRB, which is the body that designates historic properties in DC. Historic properties can be listed on their own, such as Pierce Mill, or they can be listed as a group within historic districts, such as Cleveland Park. Either way, the property is considered historic, and any alterations will be reviewed by our office. We review all exterior work that requires a permit, and adding an ADU will definitely require some kind of a permit. We don't actually issue permits, though, and you don't need to apply for permits through the Historic Preservation Office. The permitting agency is the Department of Buildings, or DOB, and you should always ask DOB any questions specifically about permits and the permit process. You'll apply for the permits through DOB, and after you apply for a permit, DOB will then send that permit out to a bunch of different reviewers and agencies, depending on what the work is. And one of those review agencies is us, the Historic Preservation Office. For the Historic Preservation Office, there are two main pathways for reviewing a permit. First is staff level reviews, also referred to as desk reviews from the time when you used to apply for a permit in person. And second is board reviews, which are done by the Historic Preservation Review Board, or the HPRB. The HPRB only looks at about 3% of permit reviews, with staff clearing the rest. The HPRB is a 9-person board. Each member is appointed by the mayor and approved by the council. Members are typically architects, historians, archaeologists, and citizens who live in the district. Besides the HPRB and staff reviews, there are a couple of other review processes, such as with the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts in Old Georgetown, but I won't get into those right now because it doesn't really relate to Cleveland Park. But you're welcome to ask me about those types of reviews at the end or by email. For our purposes tonight, it's really only important to know staff level reviews and board reviews. And depending on the type of ADU you're making, it can fall under either one of those review types. So the main difference between the two is generally the size of the project and the level of change. So minor projects are staff reviews, larger projects are board reviews. For example, if you're adding a basement ADU and the only major change is a new basement door, then that will be a staff level review. On the other hand, if you're going to build a large addition to the house or a new structure on the alley, then that would most likely be a board review. Most staff reviews can be cleared within a few days or even on the same day. Most board reviews, on the other hand, take at least a couple months, maybe more. The reason why they take longer is because the board only meets on a monthly basis, and public involvement is also required in the process. So the project will need to be noticed, which requires 21 days, and you'll need to present to the local ANC. In Cleveland Park, projects that go to the board are also encouraged to be presented to the Cleveland Park Historical Society's Architectural Review Committee. So the board reviews are admittedly more time-consuming and they involve extra steps, but don't let that discourage you, because the staff at the Historic Preservation Office will work with you and give you some feedback on your design before the meeting so that it is more likely to be approved without comment, hopefully. Whether your ADU gets reviewed by the staff or by the board, it will be reviewed according to our guidelines and historic preservation laws. So the guidelines are available on our website and are organized by topic. They are all based on the DC Historic Preservation Law and on federal standards. A big thing to keep in mind is that there are no historic preservation guidelines specifically for ADUs because our office does not regulate use or interiors. So when we review ADUs, we're only looking at how the ADU expresses itself on the outside of the building. It's entirely about the appearance. So if the ADU will require a new door or an egress window, then we review those things in accordance with our door and window guidelines or with our guidelines for new basement entrances. If you're going to make an addition to a house or garage for an ADU, then we'd review it according to our guidelines on additions. And if you decide to make an entirely new structure on the alley, then we'd review it like we would any other new construction project. So ADUs are simply reviewed by what they appear to be on the outside and not what they will become on the inside. So we don't review use. When we look at your project and compare it to the guidelines in preservation law, that's called design review. And design review is the managed change of historic properties. So the goal of the preservation law is not to keep everything frozen in place like we're in Colonial Williamsburg. Change is allowed and is built into the law. But the purpose of the design review is to just make sure that any alterations done to a historic property or within a historic district are compatible with the historic context. So in the most basic of terms, this means that whatever is new shouldn't overpower what is old. The alterations should blend into the context and not become overly noticeable. Modern alterations shouldn't draw your attention away from the historic buildings and sites. At the same time, we don't want new construction to completely copy the historic properties either. That's not good because it's not an honest way of designing it. We still want to be able to have very clear what is historic and what is new. So this can all be a balancing act. And the way we achieve that balance of compatibility is through things like the scale, the proportion, rhythm, massing, height, roof, shape, and a lot of other design principles. So whether it goes to the staff or to the board, a project will go through design review to make sure the changes are compatible. One process is just a little longer than the other, but they should both hopefully reach the same point in the end. Once the design review is completed, then the permit can be approved and issued and the work can start. So the process can seem confusing, but just always contact our office with questions and we'll guide you through it. And the Department of Buildings is also good at guiding homeowners through the permitting process. In our office, we assign a different staff member to each historic district, and I'm the primary reviewer for Cleveland Park. And so you can always contact me with any questions. So that's all the basics. And now I'm going to spend a little bit of time going into some more specific examples. So have you already learned tonight, there are quite a lot of ways to add an ADU to a historic property. And the two most common ways that we see them in historic districts is either alley housing or basement apartments. We also sometimes see them in the form of a new addition to a house, but not as often. Basement ADUs, also commonly called English basements, are most common to row houses. So in a neighborhood like Cleveland Park, it's typically more common to see ADUs in the form of alley structures or rear structures. So I'll give examples of all of these. So first, we'll talk about the basement ADUs. Under almost every circumstance, a basement ADU will be a staff level approval. In some cases, and especially for row houses, the building might already be designed for an English basement. It has the exterior door, maybe even the proper windows. The only work that might be required could be almost all on the inside. And that's the easiest kind of review. In the event that you do need to replace an existing exterior door or window, then just follow our guidelines on those topics. And the guidelines that are also on our website. Generally, with everything, it's always typically best to replace in kind, or in other words, to match the existing in terms of design and size. Also, sometimes materials, but we do allow alternative materials. So sometimes you might need to add a new basement entrance to the front to access the ADU. This is considered a staff level review, and the work is actually very routine. We deal with these all the time. So we have guidelines on our website specifically for this topic. When we review new basement entrances, we're looking for a few things during the design review. First, the new entrance should be visually discrete and subordinate to the main entrance of the house. Remember how I said earlier that a goal of design review is to make sure that the new doesn't distract from the old. So the new entrance should also not result in alterations to the main entrance stair or the porch, or if there's a projecting bay. So for example, we wouldn't want a person to cut a front porch in half to make room for a basement entrance. The house's original features should remain. Installing a basement entrance, if it's on the front, it should be an additive process and not a destructive one. And similarly, the new work should also respect the landscape as well as the house. So if the house is built on a slope, so there's like a little hill and retaining wall out front, which is very common in Cleveland Park, we wouldn't want someone to just remove the wall and dig right through the slope that grade. So I'll illustrate some of these issues with some examples. So first, we have a couple bad examples. In the image on the left, you can see how the new entrance was built in a way that makes it very noticeable to the point that it might get confused for being the main entrance. It also required the partial destruction of the terrain in the front and of the retaining wall. And then on the right, half of the front porch was removed. And a change like this is so unusual that it becomes kind of extra noticeable through its absurdity. Here are some better ways to go about adding a basement entrance. In these two examples, you can see how the new entrance is discrete to the point of being almost invisible. Both doors are reached via a single walkway from the sidewalk. The main entrance still appears primary. The majority of the landscaping is retained, and the front stairs and projecting bays are not modified. So front porch row houses or duplexes are pretty common in Cleveland Park. That you see them around, like these examples right here on 35th Street and Porter Street. So it wouldn't be difficult to add new basement entrances to houses like these for a basement ADU with like what we just talked about. So as you can see on this slide, this shows what the typical front yard plan looks like for one of these types of houses. So you have a small stair near the sidewalk. and then a walkway up to the main stair, which goes up to the front porch and then to the house. And the front porch has only a crawl space underneath in this case and is blocked with lattice. So on the left of the image is the neighbor's walkway, and the stair does the exact same thing. So on the right is an example of a compatible plan. So the small stair near the sidewalk remains, and no new cuts are made in the retaining wall. Instead, there's a little branch off of the main walkway that leads to a new stair that goes below the porch. And then a landing is made down there, and then new doors placed under the porch. And the other half of the porch remains original. Here it is in section on the left. So the front landscaping is retained. Maybe some new bushes can even be added to further block the view of the new entrance. The original front porch hasn't been altered in any negative way. It's even easier if you want to add a new basement entrance to the side of a house where it has little to no visibility from the street. And new basement entrances on the side are rather common in Cleveland Park because there are so many freestanding houses, more so than the connected houses. The same principles for basement entrances also apply if you want to add a new basement window or a window well, or if you need to enlarge an existing basement window. Some of these things might also be required for a basement ADU. And so if the window is added in the rear or on the side and is largely out of public view, then the review standards are not as strict at all. If the window is visible in the front, then you'd apply just the same design guidelines I just talked about for basement entrances. So you keep it discreet and make minimal alterations to the historic house in order to install the windows. So for example, you might end up with something like these examples right here. And just like with basement entrances, new window wells, basement windows, and enlarged windows are all typically staff level approvals. Window wells are included in the same guidelines as the basement entrances. So next we'll talk about the ADUs that you'll find in the alley. Alley houses have a very long history in DC, but the surviving historic examples are most common in neighborhoods like Capitol Hill and Georgetown. Housing like what you see here was never really found in Cleveland Park. In Cleveland Park, the most common structure you'll see in the alley today probably looks something like this. The existing alley garages tend to be utilitarian in purpose. They typically don't have much in the way of design. So if you have a garage in the back that looks like this, then it's generally fine from a historic preservation perspective to tear it down and replace it with an ADU. However, if you build an ADU in an alley in Cleveland Park, it shouldn't necessarily look like one of the historic alley houses that you see on the left. The image on the left is from Capitol Hill, and that neighborhood has a very different context from Cleveland Park. So alley structures in Cleveland Park should generally match the other housing styles you see in the neighborhood, which can include modern and contemporary designs, as long as the new structure doesn't overly distract from the historic structures around it. Now, if you do live in one of the few houses in Cleveland Park that still have a historic alley building like a carriage house, then you shouldn't tear that down. Same thing goes if your garage doesn't look like one of the ones on the right, but instead kind of looks like a mini version of your house. So if it looks like your garage and house were built at the same time and they share some design features, that we wouldn't probably want to see it demolished. In cases like that, it would be best to just adapt the existing building to be an ADU, which can include possibly adding a second story or modifying the doors and windows. So an important thing to keep in mind with alley ADUs, though, is that the work will most likely not be considered a staff approval. Instead, the work will probably need to go to the Historic Preservation Review Board. Staff is allowed to sign off only if the height isn't changing, or if a new structure will only be 1 story tall. But if the ADU will be 2 stories, or if you're going to add a second story to an existing structure, then it'll probably have to go to the board. So here are a couple examples from Cleveland Park. The garage on the left is behind Lowell Street and has a small area on top for people. The example on the right is behind Rodman Street and was actually profiled in the Washington Post a couple years ago. As you can see in the new photo at the left, this particular alley still has some stone remnants from some original 1920s automobile garages. And so this new ADU project retained those walls at either side and then built in between. And then the colors help to connect the building to the red brick found in the immediate area. So this is an example of a design that complements the other modern and contemporary structures that you see in Cleveland Park. Here are some other examples found in other DC historic districts outside of Cleveland Park. These examples use similar scale and materials to what is found in their historic districts. And a lot of this will also depend on the context of the alley. Some alleys have a lot of brick, while some don't. In some cases, using carriage doors instead of overhead garage doors works best. Some alleys, like in the image at the upper left, have kind of a continuous row of connected garages that creates almost like a wall. Notice how in the new ADU there on top, there's a slight separation sort of between the garage level and the second story ADU. And so that was done to kind of respect that existing line of garages. New alley structures should also generally match the roof forms that you find elsewhere in the alley. So like in alleys in Capitol Hill, flat roofs are usually best. But then in alleys in Cleveland Park, it would be appropriate to have a gable roof as well. It's also best to make windows vertical in appearance rather than being horizontal or some other shape. This is because that would likely create the least distracting appearance. And all of these design principles would also apply if the ADU is a structure in the backyard rather than just on an alley, which is also common in Cleveland Park, where that might be accessed by a driveway instead of the alley. It's all the same principles apply. Finally, you might also add an ADU by making an addition to the main house. In this case, the work will most likely get reviewed by the board instead of by staff. Staff is allowed to review side and rear additions if they have limited visibility from the street and if they're under a certain size. The threshold is typically about 250 square feet on one level or 500 square feet on two or more levels. So anything under that can probably be a staff review, and anything over that would be a board review. So most ADUs will probably be board reviews. On this slide, you can see an example of a relatively small rear addition at the right. The rear addition is circled in red. Something like that would be a compatible design and could maybe be a staff review. The side addition on the left, which is also circled, would need to be a board review because of the size, but also because of the visibility. However, the design itself can still be compatible. It's smaller and shorter than the original house and shares some design details. There have been some side additions in Cleveland Park that kind of look like this. The old and new complement each other, but it's still clear where the original house begins and ends. There's a clear line of separation. The one thing that probably could be changed is to maybe give the new addition a little bit more of a setback, push back further from the street. But these are the types of principles that the board uses for the design review of additions. The board will consider things like the setback, orientation, scale, proportion, rhythm, massing, height, materials, roof shape, any other details, and just make sure that the new respects the old and doesn't create anything distracting. We don't want someone walking down the street and pointing and wondering, what is that? It should just kind of blend. Anything new should blend into the background. And so that covers the basics. If you want more information on something I talked about, then you can visit our website. The link is up there. Our website has all the design guidelines as well as information on historic alley dwellings if you're interested in the history of that building type. And you can also always email me with any questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Todd. And thank you, Ileana. That was great. So much good content was covered. It looks like we got the chat function working again. So if anyone wants to pop a comment into that, please do so, or you can put your question there or into the Q&A. And I know there was a little bit of a sidebar conversation going on, but I just want to mention it for everyone in case anyone missed it. Scott was asking about if a Department of Building certificate of occupancy was required when basement ADUs are created. And I see, Ileana, that you said ADUs, basement or garages require a separate leasing license, so a certificate of occupancy is required. Do you want to add anything else to that?
Yeah, let me just clarify that DC has different names to call additional dwelling units. Sometimes they're secondary dwellings, sometimes they're apartments, so different names for it. Some require a certificate of occupancy, but in general, if you're going to rent it or if you're going to have it occupied for short-term leases, if you want to write a lease, the city will need some kind of paper that says this is legal, this is ready, complies with the building code. Sometimes that's called a certificate of occupancy. Sometimes there are certain zones where they say, oh, you don't require CFO, but, so the idea that you need a legal paper that says this dwelling is rentable, most times it's a CFO, but sometimes you're not required. You only need the business license. So check with your zone and your type of building.
Yeah. Yeah, great advice. And Todd, I have a question for you. You were mentioning how HPO isn't going to be putting out any design guidelines specific to ADUs, and it makes sense for some of the stuff like the doors, windows, things like that, because if you're going to have an interior ADU, I mean, it wouldn't be any different than, right, if you were already modifying your historic home. But I do know that the city is planning to finalize design guidelines on alley buildings and garages. Is that correct? And if
Yeah.
so, is that sort of a response to the ADU question?
Partly, it's also just because we get a lot of projects in the alley, not just for ADUs, but also just for, garages, even sheds and those garage door things that people put up. Those are all very frequent. And so we just try to put design guidelines out for frequent work that we encounter a lot.
Yeah.
So that it's more, so it makes it easier for people to provide all the right stuff when they go for the permit.
That makes sense.
So yeah, so partly for ADUs, but also just partly for all the other stuff that happens in the alley.
Yeah, and when we started putting this panel together, I think I said this to you guys. Like when I thought of an ADU, I always thought about it as a detached building, these alley dwelling and garage types of buildings, and not so much the interior use. So I can see where there would be a need for some guidance related to those kinds of structures. And Ileana, I think you laid out there is those three types. There's the interior ADU, addition, and detached. Would you say those are the three buckets?
Yeah, they have to do with the relationship of the existing building. Think about it as under, attached, or detached.
Okay.
There are a lot of conditions that, depending on the building you want, or the existing conditions of the main building, of the size of the lot, that will send you one way or another, based on your budget, based on what you want to do with a building. There is no rule that one type works better than others. It all matters that will satisfy what you need. I want to clarify one thing about alley lots versus additional dwelling units. Alley lots are not considered ADUs because it's a single dwelling on a single lot. The difference is that the alley lots do not face a public street except for the alleys they serve. So the zoning rule that applies to alley lots is different from the zoning rules that apply to additional dwelling units. Because alley lots, they're probably zero setback everywhere. It's basically a lot that you cannot access from the street. So you're going to be looking at a completely different section of the book that refers to alley lots versus accessory buildings. So they're like two different animals, even if they both face the street. The alley lot is not connected to a house. The additional dwelling unit is secondary to a main structure.
I see. I'm glad that came out. That's a really great clarification, and I can see how those two would get muddled a little bit. So that's really great.
This happens a lot in Capitol Hill, where certain homeowners, and have lots of cases like that, they own a little chunk of a lot across their own alley. And the lot itself, it's a separate tax base, it's a separate element, and they want to develop an ADU. And I insist on no, that's a separate building altogether. It's a separate home, it's a separate lot, even if you own both, right? So it's a single family home in an independent lot that's not facing the street.
I see. Yeah, that's good. I'm glad you clarified that.
It's a weird situation. Happens a lot in Capitol Hill.
Okay.
Lots of alley lots. They're all beautiful, but
yeah, maybe it's more prominent up there. So with the three buckets of ADUs, what do you find the most common? I think I know the answer to this, but what would you say, what would be the percentage amongst those that ADUs in the city that you've seen kind of fall into? Would you say a vast majority are the
sorry. Todd, do you want to answer this or do you want me to go after it?
What?
You can answer. You
Okay,
can say
so I
first.
see a 50-50 between freestanding and basements. Freestanding, I see them a lot in Southeast, but also a lot in townhouses where the alleys in the center of the block and have very, very deep lots. So that allows me to create a structure or renovate a structure in the rear. Those are very good for freestanding. Sometimes they're detached, sometimes they're attached. There are a lot of design decisions you want to do. And the other 50% is at a basement just because the basement's there. So the issue is that in many projects, when we start looking at it, we realize that the ADU in the basement, basically you have to give up a third of your house. And a lot of homeowners are not willing to make that commitment for the future because they say, well, it all sounds great, but it's like a tough decision to make. So it sounds like basement should be more popular, but in a way it affects the future use of the house so much that depends on the size of the house and the family planning that a lot of people may not be willing to do it. Sometimes in the design process, people say, oh, let's just renovate it and create just a usable basement, but that it's part of the house instead of a separate dwelling. So that like basement decision, it's kind of it's harder to decide what to do with your basement than what to do with your garage.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. Very interesting. Todd, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would say we see it about the same, where it's kind of a 50-50 split, but it really depends on the historic district. Obviously Georgetown, Capitol Hill, there's quite a lot of the basement ADUs, not so much in Cleveland Park. Also, the space issue is something, because a lot of times we actually see the opposite, where somebody has a basement that might have been used as an ADU in the past, but they want to just close it off and, incorporate with the rest of the house because they want more space. But yeah, we see about 50-50 split, really.
Okay. Yeah, very interesting. And that you guys agree on that. Andrea, please jump in here.
Yeah, I had two not connected questions, but one I was wondering about if there are parking requirements for either creating English basement or doing an addition.
No. About parking requirements in DC, we're fortunate they're very, very generous. In general, you need to preserve, if you have an existing parking access, you need to preserve it, right? Or replace it. Per the zoning code, a parking space is a 10 by 20 area accessible from any public point, so an alley or a front yard. Say you want to renovate a garage, the city may say, well, you're giving up parking, you still need to provide one. So as a design suggestion, I would say, hey, create a patio next to it with a moving gate. So from a zoning perspective, that is a parking surface because it's accessible, it's flat, and it's a parking surface. So it's like, you have either gravel or concrete or whatever. You can use it for parking or you can use it as, entertainment outdoor space. So if you give up the space you have, the indoor garage, even if you didn't use it to park because it was too small, the city sees it that you have a curb cut in the alley, so they're counting it as a parking space. So they will require that if you use that building for people instead of cars, that you provide the same space somewhere on your property. You don't need to add additional parking spaces. Nobody wants that. Depends on the neighborhood, but in general, nobody wants it. And the interest of having access to the alley for cars, it comes down to a lot of my clients now have electric cars and they like to charge them like on site. So, while we're doing all the mess of the ADU, adding a car charger is pennies. So it becomes more like a plus that we end up having in the property instead of a minus. Like, hey, you pave a little larger area, you use it for barbecue, then you move the grill and charge the car when you're not using it. It's one of those things like, yeah, okay, you demand parking here. You have the parking and I end up with a, barbecue area.
And Scott had another question. He asked, does the current DC Office of Planning Historic Preservation office, future land use map. I'm trying to decipher all these acronyms to use. Discussion, address ADUs at all? Do either one of you have any insight on that?
It doesn't.
Oh, okay.
I haven't seen anything that significantly changes what we do regarding ADUs. I wish it did. I think there's a huge margin to be more generous in the development of ADUs, duplex, and subdividing existing single-family homes. But the current and the proposed zoning doesn't give us anything more than what we have. So we need to work with what we have and not with what we want.
Well, and because you have such a good understanding of ADUs, I bet you've looked at other cities. Is there a city that you think DC should model itself on from an ADU standpoint?
I think giving up parking is the number one thing. The number two thing is getting rid of the owner occupancy requirement. The fact that the city will not give you 2 rental licenses in case you move out or you inherit the house, or you move out and you don't want to sell. Those 2 things discourage most of my clients. Are like, well, I don't know what I'm going to do in 5 years. And the fact that I can't keep the property because I won't be able to rent both makes the investment extremely hard to justify in like the macro thing, right? Yeah. So those 2 things, owner occupancy requirement and parking, those are 2 big and very easy. All it takes is like just get rid of that paragraph. Yeah. Things that are a little more challenging, and I wish the city would get rid of, is I think they're changing this. The maximum building footprint right now is 450 square feet. That's tiny. That also means that if you use a wheelchair, you can't have a dwelling that satisfies the needs of a person with a disability. I think that is getting changed to 650. It's still very tight, but I'll take that. So the maximum area of the ADU, that was also a huge barrier for people. It's like, well, I love the idea, I just don't want to live in a shoebox. I mean, and it doesn't cost that much to make a larger building. So that discourages a lot of people. And I think that eventually I wish the city, and this is a huge wish, I don't know if any city has done it, that allows for homeowners to turn their properties that you can own them. Basically, you can sell the ADU, but keep like share ownership of the site and keep ownership of the front. Kind of like creating your own mini condo building, a mini condo association. That would allow a lot of starting homes. So you want to make an investment, instead of buying a studio somewhere, you buy a studio off of like the neighborhood you like. That would also encourage a lot of people to build it because it makes the returning investment a lot easier to receive. Don't forget that this is a real estate investment, right? I mean, you're pulling money from somewhere and building something that's going to stay on the land. And the more barriers that the city puts for individuals to recoup that money or have some kind of reassurance that will happen, the less people want to do it. It's just a money. Right now, there's so many barriers that make this a difficult investment that I find that it's like the biggest barrier. People say, well, great, I'm going to put 200, 300,000 and I won't be able to rent it, or I can't sell it, or, there's like, I think that the city could give us that. And that wouldn't affect at all it wouldn't affect the neighborhood, right? I mean, who cares if your ADU is rented or owned by a different individual? So it would just be a paragraph that they can add.
Yeah. And that's actually a really good segue, because I know when we were originally putting this panel together, me and Andrew, we were talking about having the voice of a homeowner, and it was harder to find a homeowner for our panel. And maybe at a future point, we can do a panel with a homeowner. But Todd and Ileana, I would just like to hear a little bit about homeowners you've interacted with, and maybe certain misconceptions or ideas that they had. And, maybe they had this particular vision that looked like A, but then by the time of the process, it looked more like B. I'd just like to hear a little bit about that, speaking more from that angle, the homeowner.
Todd, do you want to go
ahead? First, I should also say, based on the last question there, historic preservation doesn't really look at the zoning, parking, future land use maps, but the Office of Planning does. and the Office of Planning is in the middle of working on the next comprehensive plan, DC 2050. So if anybody has any comments or anything about stuff to do, to change, you could email planning@dc.gov. They're trying to get all the public feedback right now. So it's planning@dc.gov.
Yeah, great
As far,
suggestion.
yeah, if you could also just send stuff to me and I can forward it on to the right people as well. But as far as working with the homeowners, I think a lot of people just sometimes get like they think that they're not allowed to change something because it's an historic district or they can't build something new. So I think there's just kind of a lot of misconceptions around everything. And so I just want people to know, like, change is okay. We have all our design guidelines. Email us. I mean, you can even look at some of the past projects that have been done that went through the board or in your neighborhood. You'll see that there's this stuff. It's not as hard from like a preservation point of view necessarily to get these things done.
Yeah, and you mentioned the minor versus major work too, and staff
Yeah,
level approval versus the board. Yeah, very good points.
yeah.
Ileana.
I want to say a few things. An additional dwelling unit is nothing but a small house. There's no anything weird about it. It has four walls and a roof, bathroom, kitchen, and that's it. Even after saying that, we don't need to pay extra to get it 3D printed in concrete or shipped from Utah and craned in. In fact, Easy does it. Don't think that a complicated construction system is going to save you time or money or is going to make the whole process easier. In fact, any prefab system I've studied so far cost about 20 to 30% more than a traditional 2x6 siding that we do it so well. There's lots of cosmetic options that work. So don't overcomplicate the idea of an ADU by being like people selling you construction systems that are not guaranteed yet, they're not tested, they're not priced correctly. So beware of the bells and whistles that people try to sell in like they're trying to solve housing issues by reinventing something bizarre. I mean, years ago, Silicon Valley came up with a massive juicero or something like that was like a blender that gave you this like horrible juice. And it became sort of like the laughing stock because like it was less efficient, more expensive, lasted less, and it was uglier than a traditional juicer. And it became like the example of when we try to apply technologies that are untested for problems that are extremely simple. You're missing homes for a population that can't afford the homes that are available. Build more homes. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. If you have a garage that it's unused, turn it into a house instead of parking a car, instead of using it for a car or for storing stuff, use it for people. That's from an urban perspective. And from a homeowner's perspective, again, Easy does it. If you have a portion of your property, be it an empty backyard, or you may have a personal need that your quality of life will improve by sharing a space. Think of family, think of children or friends with special needs, people that can live semi-independently. Think about, don't worry too much about how like the design itself of the building, but what you're looking to live, like what you want your life to be like, right? Instead of having your mom retire all the way in a retirement community that's going to be 45 minutes away, well, how your quality of life will be if your mom or your aunt lived in the backyard, right? Yes, there's a cost to it, but how does that fit into the long-term planning? And then start talking with, I don't know, I do it. There are many other architects that do it as well. Talk with people that experience that. Fortunately, clients are like, they couldn't come today, but they're super chatty and they love to show you around. I have two clients actually in Southeast whose properties face each other in the alley. One is a Vietnam vet. The other one is a couple from California in their 60s. They moved from Santa Barbara to live with their daughter that has a kid. They were featuring an ARP video called Tiny Homes or Tiny Living or something. It's a whole series that they did. ARP is very, very media savvy. They have amazing YouTube videos. Anyways, so don't think about, my advice to clients is like, you're going to pay the architect, the builder, you're going to fight with the city over the red tape, the work. We know technically what needs to happen, right? Whether historic preservation, construction details, estimate and costing, design, all kinds of stuff. The goal of the homeowner is to say, what do I want to live like? And then you design a building. Say you plan to age in place. That's a very typical thing. Well, if you have a garage and you want to add an apartment, don't put the stairs on the outside. And I know it's extremely silly, but that is where you start, not with the apartment above the garage, but with the age, right? So start backwards when you're designing or when you're asking what you want and how you want to live. So don't worry too much about it. It's not, there are many secret sauces, but it's not that secret, actually. It's fun. It's not difficult. It's not cheap, but hey, what is cheap? That's what I would say. I mean, we all do it a lot. Todd does it from historic. I have tons of people in DOB that they know their stuff. They want to get it approved, but you need to know what you want before you start.
Yeah, I think that's great advice to worry about the real personal stuff and the fundamental core issues to you, and then leave the more complicated questions to someone like you, Ileana, and then someone like Todd, who can hopefully both of you can answer some of the more complicated regulatory questions. So I think that's a good place to end. I don't see any other questions or comments tonight, but I want to just thank both of you for fantastic presentations. I know I learned something tonight, especially about the alley buildings and the lots. And I'm just happy that
get cut off on.
And I'm just happy that DC Preservation League could collaborate again with Cleveland Park Historical Society, and hopefully we'll be doing another session in the near future on another topic that's important to everyone. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you all for coming. It was really
Thank you.
wonderful. Yeah, learned a lot as well.
Feel free to reach out to the league. Zach or Andrea always answer questions, or to us directly. If we don't know the answer, I'm happy to forward it to whoever will have the answer.
Perfect. Thank you so
you
much,
all.
you guys. Have a good
Take
night.
care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Have
you.
a good night.